I think that a lot of the times we approach fantasy world building with the wrong mindset. Our modern minds are too focused on the things that we know. Science, how nature works in our world. But for fantasy world building, this kind of thinking can be detrimental. Part of the problem is D&D is a pretty nerdy hobby, right? There's probably a big overlap between scientists and engineers and people who play. And when we get together, we like to talk about things that we know, especially among other people who share a similar interest. And I have to admit that I too am kind of guilty of this. I can see the appeal in trying to figure out exactly how a dragon's fire breath would work. Go ahead and look at some world building forums. You'll find all sorts of posts telling you which way rivers should flow and how centaurs can bear weight. And if that's your pleasure, go ahead and lose yourself in that. But as far as storytelling and world building goes, I think that approach is kind of a red herring. None of that helps tell a compelling story. In fact, I'm going to argue that if you drop that scientific real-world mindset, it's easier to seep in a sense of fantasy wonder and give your world a sense of mystery and vibrancy. Instead of approaching our world with a scientific mindset, we should be looking at it with a mythic mindset. I mean, can you honestly imagine an elf saying that these mountain range is caused by plate tectonics? No. Those mountains are the spine of a titan dragon that was buried eons ago. Are storms caused by pressure systems or by feuding giants? The Emperor's flavor text is a great example of this. It can affect the environment around it by its mood. When an Emperor is unhappy, the clouds might cry tears of salt water. The wildflowers and surrounding meadows might wilt. Dead fish might wash up on the shores of lakes and rivers. Or a nearby forest might lose their leaves from its trees. When an Empyrean is jubilant, sunlight follows it everywhere, small animals frolic in its footsteps, and birds fill the sky with their pleasing songs. You can go deeper with this too. Great myths also contain moral or existential truths. It's part of what separates myths from legends or folktales. And remember that good and evil, law and chaos are fundamental forces in the universe, as real as gravity or electricity. If folks in Fantasyland accept and know this because it's true, why can't allegory also be true? Does rust occur because of oxidation or because it's a manifestation of chaos? In my setting, fear, anger, revenge, and jealousy are all real beings. They are powerful fiends in Archfey, expelled from the gods when they would experience a powerful emotion. So, why do objects in temples not rust? It's not just because magic. It's because the demon lord Decay can't enter there. That mythic explanation reinforces the fundamental truth of the world, that the gods are timeless. And when we give a mythic explanation, we don't want to just artlessly dump lore onto our players. Great world building is done with drama, with emotion and conflict. If you're going to tell players that the forest was sprang into existence by an elf queen, you need to tell them that the first trees grew when the ancient queen planted arrows of her own quiver into the ground, vowing to forever keep her people safe by secrecy. When we talk about the way real-world people traditionally thought about magic, there are two main types: fallacious magic and sympathetic magic. And while our ancestors were wrong, they weren't stupid. A lot of what they're thinking might seem silly to us today, but it's proof that those people were trying to understand and control the world around them, just like we do today. And as DMs, by understanding how real-world people thought about magic, we can build more real feeling magical worlds. In other words, if the way folks thought about magic in the real world where it doesn't exist could seem reasonable, it would certainly seem reasonable, those same sort of explanations would certainly seem reasonable in a world where magic does exist. While researching for this video, I came across what is now my favorite Reddit post of all time. I'll go ahead and link it in the description below the like and subscribe buttons. But the juice of it is this: medieval fallacious magical thinking was essentially people applying known concepts to areas of reality where they don't apply. All right, so check this. Disease, it changes people and it moves from person to person. It makes them act in odd ways. It makes their bodies behave differently. It can take over someone and cause them to feel wrong. Anger also changes people. It makes them act in odd ways. It makes their bodies behave differently. It can take someone over and cause them to feel wrong. Anger too spreads. It can move from person to person. So, if drinking the sweat of a man that has pox will make you ill, will drinking the sweat of a murderer make you feel angry? If you think that sounds impossible, it's only because of your modern thinking, your modern notion of germ theory, which does not exist in Fantasyland. In fact, that conclusion, if you adopt this mythic thinking mindset, not only sounds plausible, it sounds pretty reasonable. It might even be true. If a red sunrise means that someone will die in a storm later on today, why wouldn't it also mean that someone will die in a battle? Another type of magical thinking is called sympathetic magic. And you see this prominently in the new UA Artificer. An object's material and nature impart some magic onto it. Because a rock is a rock, it may be able to impart rock-like qualities onto a non-rock. For all of our philosophizers out there, this is similar to Plato's idea of forms. A book might contain knowledge only because it has tapped into, it has taken part of some aspect of the ideal form of knowledge. Therefore, this book may have the power to transmit access to the form of knowledge. Through this book, you may take part in the knowing. People in the real world used to think that almonds were good for your eyes because they were eye-shaped, and that rose petals were good for your blood because they were red. But folks in Fantasyland know that the essence of one thing can be transferred to another. What sort of conclusions would they draw with this? If you knock out a man's tooth, it's gone forever. But shark teeth can grow back. If you harvest a pea plant, it's gone forever. But tomatoes grow back each year. And different soils affect the way plants grow. If you bury shark teeth in your soil, will your pea plants grow back the next year? In a magical world, I'd lean towards yes. What's funny is we still believe in magical thinking today, even if we don't want to admit it. And I'm gonna prove to you that you probably believe in magic. If a friend gave you a jacket, you'd probably wear it without issue. If you went to a thrift store, a lot of folks would have no problem buying a jacket as long as it's been cleaned. But would you ever wear a jacket that's been worn by a serial killer? That feeling of creepiness is you believing in magic. So how is any of this useful for us as DMs? Well, if you're ever stuck for a hard piece of lore when a player asks, you can just make up some complete BS. Now, I'm not saying to improv something that's plausible. I mean, literally make up something that's completely ludicrous. And then ask the player what they've heard, whether or not their character believes it. People in the real world have believed all sorts of wrong, factually incorrect things. Some things to our modern understanding seem completely ridiculous. But as we just talked about, they are completely rational to a magical thinking mindset. Magical thinking makes sense in a magical world. And moreover, as the DM, when you ask the player, you just gave them the opportunity to inject some of their personality, not only into their character, but into your world. In the real world, magic traditionally occupies this weird space between religion and natural science. But in vanilla D&D Fantasyland, magic is both religion and science. The fictional world of D&D seems to suggest that magic can be studied in a scientific way. That is, wizards learn by book learning and by experimentation. And the fact that they can learn spells from another spell book does suggest that to some degree magic is empirical. The disconnect is that the study of magic doesn't seem to tie into how the rest of the world functions. And that is the mistake that most world builders make. In a fantasy world, understanding the weave, the nature of magic, also unlocks understanding of phenomena that we know in the real world. That is, the same thing that makes the spell levitate work is also what makes gravity work. In a lot of ways, this can be a lot more satisfying too. Saying a fireball works underwater because magic is dull. Saying a fireball works underwater because it's temporarily exchanging that space with a place on the plane of fire is exciting and satisfying and rational. The Sage Advice podcast, where Jeremy Crawford talks about anti-magic field, gives you some really great insight into this. For example, would an anti-magic field shut off a dragon's breath weapon? The answer is no, because that's part of the background magic of the world. The supplemented physics, the magically supplemented physics that is Fantasyland's version of nature. D&D uses a soft magic and a hard magic system at the same time. That is, the DM can use whatever magic they want, but the players have limits and they know what those limits are. The players always know exactly how much power it costs to create a spell, what that spell is going to do, and have a reasonable understanding of how their magic is going to interact. What about that soft magic that the DM has to use to create a sense of wonder? Well, to keep the same fiction, we could just say that's natural phenomena that is not fully understood. I mean, after all, how long was lightning around before we realized how to harness it and use its cousin to our purposes? And while bards and sorcerers have hard magic as mechanics, their story is definitely more geared towards soft magic. They don't seem to fully know what they're doing. For comparison, you can imagine the verbal components of a bard's and a wizard's spell both have the same rhythm and pitch difference. The wizard knows that blood flow is controlled by 3 distinct sounds in succession. The bard knows via sympathetic magic that singing a song about feeling good makes your companions feel better. Yeah, so that's it. That's the video, folks. This is a kind of a weird topic, right? I don't really hear a lot about this, so I'm really interested to know what you think. I try to respond to almost every comment, so let me know what you think in the comments below.
I just want to point out that in the real world, rust is not a manifestation of chaos. You're trading 3 moles of a gas for 2 of a solid. The net entropy is decreasing.